Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Adam Michel. I'm the Director of Tax Policy Studies here at the Cato Institute, and I'm joined by my colleague Norbert Michel, Vice President and Director of the Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. We're not related, although I would be honored if we were. We're also joined by Megan McArdle of the Washington Post. She's a prolific writer and the author of The Upside of Down, a book about taking risks and learning from failure. We're here today to discuss Norbert's book, Crushing Capitalism. The subtitle is How Populist Policies Are Threatening the American Dream. Not to second guess our marketing team, but it seems to me more like the important message of Norbert's book is something like how a misunderstanding of basic economic trends over the last half century have led to both costly policies that seek to remedy a phantom problem of populists' own imagination. Hopefully with that very brief summary, you can see how this book is perfectly timed for this policy moment. The current debates over tariffs, over immigration, over industrial policy, they usually start from the premise that something went terribly wrong in the past. That the middle class is hollowed out, ravaged by the churn of profit-seeking global capitalists. But even if you don't like the particular tools that Trump is using to remedy these problems, these conversations usually start with the premise that there is some deep economic failure that's worth remedying. So that's where I'd like to start. Start with you, Norbert. How has the American middle class fared? And sort of where do these popular narratives ultimately go wrong?
Thanks, Adam. So I agree with you. The premise is the issue here, and it's one that the book rejects. I lay out the arguments for these populist policies are kind of resting on two faulty foundations. One is that income has stagnated over the past 5 decades. The middle class has been hollowed out because it's had no income growth. The second is that manufacturing has been decimated mainly by free trade, which is what led to that stagnation. And what I do in here, a large part of the book, is to make the case that both of those premises are wrong, or if you want to call that one premise, it's wrong. The income one is easier to show. There's actually been an enormous amount of income growth. Americans have been growing richer and wealthier for all of the 19th century. Even the lower income folks in America historically have been doing better, not worse. And there's a lot of different ways to show that. So you can look at household income, you can look at individual income, you can look at different wage measures, different income measures, you can look at the standard sort of surveys that are out, you can look at more specialized surveys that follow the same people through time. And all of these things show an enormous amount of growth, an enormous amount of income growth. Just one quick example using household income. It shows that the middle class has just done great over the last 5 decades. The share of households earning more than $100,000 has tripled. More than tripled, actually, more than tripled. And the share earning under $35,000 has shrunk by about 25%. And then if you keep going down, so you look at, say, the lowest 10% of income earners, over much of those decades, like about 4 out of the 5, they have had, in those groups, stronger income growth than most of the other groups, even some of the higher groups. These are just basic facts, right? So what's going on? Well, the populists that make that stagnation argument, they can only back that up by cherry-picking the data. And the cherry picking means that you're selective with a few things, or at least one of a few things. Either the income measure itself, the time period that you're using, or the inflation adjustment. Of course, you could do all three, right? So basically, there's let's just say 100 ways that you could calculate income over these periods for people. And not exactly, but roughly 99 show solid income growth. One doesn't. Well, that's the one that the populists focus on. That's kind of what they're doing, And I show in the book one very clear example is somebody named Orrin Cass, who has a book where he shows the stagnation, and he uses an income measure that's produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It starts in 1964. He starts his analysis in 1975. So he goes from 75 to 2015, and he adjusts it with the Consumer Price Index instead of what's called the PCE, Personal Consumption Expenditure Index. If you just change the inflation adjustment, it's no longer stagnant. It's about 25% growth. But that's not the big one. The big one is the date, right? So if you don't, it turns out, and we show this mathematically, if you use 1975 as your starting point, that's the lowest possible growth rate that you could get using any starting year between 1964 and 2000. So, was that an accident? I don't know, but it definitely gives you the lowest growth rate possible. And there's no particular reason to pick 1975, which was the middle of a really bad decade. So that's the flavor of that on the income side. And then on the manufacturing side, we could go forever. I won't go forever. I'll just say that it's not true that manufacturing has been decimated. It's radically different than it was, in 1910, even in 1950 or 60, but it has not been decimated. We have, in the United States, the highest GDP of any country in the world, right at the highest per capita GDP. And if you look at the portion of manufacturing output and how much it contributes to that GDP, called the value added, it's higher than it's ever been in the history of the nation. Over $2.5 trillion, highest ever. So, and we could just, like I said, keep going. I won't. But what's happened is we've gotten more productive. And they do the same sort of thing, the populists. They focus on something that looks bad. So there's a decline in manufacturing employment that started basically in 1979, got even sharper in 2000. Yeah, that definitely happened. But what they're leaving out is that our reliance on manufacturing jobs, the share of employment that we get in manufacturing, that's been declining a lot longer. That's been declining, depending on how you measure it, since 1920. And service jobs have been increasing in importance since 1850. So and you can look and you can see that agriculture has an even sharper decline for an even longer period. So why isn't that a problem? Well, it's true that things are changing, and it's true that we've gotten more productive, but it's not true that we've been decimated. We have a smaller raw number of jobs than we did in 1979 in manufacturing. But we actually have more than we had in 1939. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but that's something that they leave out, and that's the kind of cherry picking and focusing on selective data that they do to come up with these ideas.
I think that's a good overview to let Megan chime in. I know that you've written in the past on how, compared to your grandparents or even your parents, today we live in a time of unprecedented abundance, that many things have gotten much better. We have access to more things, but maybe not everything has gotten better. There's this critique that has been floating around the last couple of days that I've seen pop up on it's just the laptop class that's telling us that things have gotten better. But outside of elite culture, maybe there is something that has gone wrong under the surface. Do you think there's something to this idea that the middle class has been hollowed out, or that maybe there's something missing in all the data that Norbert is pointing to?
So let me start by conceding what I think are the best points, or what I think are the reasonable arguments of the populists. And one is that, the returns to college education have dramatically increased, and that because people care about their relative social status, if you don't have a college degree, that feels pretty bad, right? That, you are kind of locked out of these jobs. And I actually think that is in many ways a bad development for society, right? Which is not to say that college diplomas are useless and people shouldn't get them, but rather that there used to be a lot of different paths into the upper tiers of the middle class, and there's now pretty much one path. There are exceptions to this, like be a basketball player, or start a successful plumbing business or something. But they are narrower. And when you add into that the fact that I think I broadly agree with economist Brian Kaplan that a lot of that activity is not so much big value adds for people with those degrees. It's that they are just signaling to employers like, hey, I'm reasonably bright and I can sit in a chair for 4 years and I will show up and I will probably turn my assignments in on time. And that's like a really expensive way to send the signal. It doesn't signal other things that are valuable in the economy. And to the extent that and then what happens though is that it's such an easy thing for employers to look at, right? And also when you add in things like anti-discrimination law, which, again, I'm not opposed to, but which means they want to have a paper trail that can show how they made the decision. It's a lot easier to be like, we just require a college diploma. And so what happens is, you require a college diploma. More people get college diplomas. HR people are like, look, I can require college diplomas for more jobs because there are people available. And there is this kind of arms race, and I think that is bad, right? And so people looking back in 1955 at a guy who could start out with a high school education and look forward to a fairly reliable middle class life, that's a little harder now for that guy, right? And that is real. And I will add that for manufacturing plants are pretty hard to move. And so those jobs tend to be sticky in some ways that service jobs aren't, right? It's just a lot. If you have this big capital asset sitting there, you are going to be reluctant to close that factory. You are going to figure out ways to, make it work. When they do move, I will point out, it's totally catastrophic often for the cities they're in, and that's the story of the Rust Belt. And I think that Oren Cass and others are responding to that story. They're responding to the fact that it's harder to form families now, and I do think that you see this, that the stability of the family has declined, and I think that part of that, not all of that, is an economic story about men's earning power relative to women's earning power. In 1955, you could be a pretty young man, get a job at a manufacturing plant or something, and buy a house. What I think they leave out, and I think sort of the irony of all of this, is that where American living standards are increasing is in tradable goods, right? We're getting much better. Where is it not increasing? It's in non-tradables. And actually the problem we have is that non-tradables are getting less and less productive, and we have offset that in part with immigration. And the problem would be even worse without immigration, to bring workers in to do things like construct housing. And so it's not so much that I don't see what they are nostalgic for. But I think that what they're nostalgic for, and I think that this critique also actually applies to the growing abundance movement on the left, who are nostalgic for a slightly different era, the kind of FDR to Great Society period, when government is doing a lot of big stuff. And I think, we can quarrel about much of the stuff that I certainly would quarrel about much of the stuff they did, but like they built the interstate highway system. That's pretty great. They built the Hoover Dam. They built the TVA. I broadly am in favor of these things. Take away my libertarian card. But that also was the product of a very specific time when the bureaucracy is young and dynamic and you are attracting a lot of entrepreneurial people. It hasn't ossified yet, and so you have a lot more, and you haven't had all of these revolutions designed to give the public a lot of veto points. And I don't think that period is replicable. I also don't think that the period in which of roughly, the beginning of World War II to 1975, when Europe has bombed its manufacturing sector flat, and therefore we are producing the plurality of all of the manufacturing, and at one point the majority of all the manufacturing output in the world. That's not a replicable period. We can't go back to that, in part, and I'll close by saying, because manufacturing jobs aren't the same. Right, and I think you were talking about value add, right? One of the interesting things about looking at China is, first of all, that China is now also losing manufacturing jobs because they're moving up the value chain, because that's what happens. People like services. As you get richer, you don't want 9 washing machines. You want to go get a massage once in a while. But also that if you look at the gap, if you look at the gap just in manufacturing output, it's almost double. Right, but if you look at the gap at value-adding manufacturing output, it's much smaller, and that is because we have moved our manufacturers up the value chain both through automation and through concentrating on higher value outputs. We don't make T-shirts anymore, and that was hard on people in T-shirt towns in the South. But we do make a lot of other high value-added outputs. I think there are some questions about should we do industrial policy for things that are strategically valuable in the there are real questions about being dependent on a geostrategic rival for inputs to war, right? Because we could end up at war with them, and we don't want them to be making all our bullets. But that's a really small segment of everything that everyone is talking about. Doing industrial policy in that area would not bring back all of the jobs that people are fantasizing about. There's a very good argument that what you then want to do is friendshore, right? You want to move stuff. Maybe we do want to move stuff out of China that's strategic, and we want to move it into allies who have manufacturing capacity and who we can count on to be there for us in the case of a war. But I think that this idea that what we actually need is for the government to just get in there and just reorganize the economy so that it looks like 1965 or 1975 or whatever you have picked as your optimal year. There are so many issues with that. But one of the biggest is simply that the external conditions for getting what they want do not exist. And God willing, we will never bomb another continent flat and bring ourselves to that point again.
Radically different time period.
And Megan alluded to the sort of subsidization of higher education and all of these sort of regulatory constraints that have been layered over on top of each other over time. You touch on in the book, Norbert, this myth that we live in a free market paradise and that all of the problems we can identify are the fault of the market and not necessarily some other intervention. Can you give us an overview of maybe how that lens fits into some of the story that Megan was telling?
Yeah, I learned in the last 5 or 6 years of the term market fundamentalist, which I didn't know that existed.
I go to church every Sunday.
It's good.
We come here every day.
Yeah.
Every day, yes. So the idea that I do a lot of financial market regulation, and that's where this kind of first hit me, this idea after the financial crisis that we had a deregulated financial sector, which is, that's as insane as you can get, really. What happened is we completely changed the way we regulated stuff, but it wasn't deregulated. And that applies broadly, across the economic spectrum, right? We started doing a lot more social and environmental regulation and that sort of thing. So we've had a lot of regulation. And what you get with the industrial policy crowd quite a bit is the sort of the retraining idea, right? Or we're subsidizing higher education, but we're not subsidizing tech training.
Yeah,
or
I thought that was a really, really powerful part of the book where you just go through all of the ways in which we are subsidizing vocational training.
Because we are, and it's just not. It's really hard to pick out in the federal budget because we've changed the programs. Roughly every 10 years, since 1960s, roughly every 10 years we do a complete overhaul, change the name of the act, everything. But the funding, I think it's from 1960 to about roughly 2020, I think the cumulative total, we went through all these things and parsed all the different programs, just one subset, something like $400 billion in real terms for all these different job training assistance programs. And even the vaunted so-called China shock, where we had supposedly this big shock from trade with China in 2001, the paper that started that term, China shock, that crushed all these jobs, which even if you look at that paper, it's not a whole lot. But nonetheless, they admit in that paper that a lot of the workers who were affected did actually avail themselves of the training and assistance in the trade assistance program that was set up to do that. So it's not the case that these people have been just cast to the side and said, you're at the mercy of the market. That is not the way we've operated. And we can have the argument of whether more or less government involvement would do the job better, right? I think that's a great argument or discussion to have, and I know it's not I'd argue on, but it's simply not the case that we've done nothing and we've just thrown everybody to the wolves. So, is that?
Yeah, excellent. I think you gave us a nice entryway into the immigration and trade conversation. Both of you have mentioned these points. I think both increased immigration and increased trade are two of the animating features of a lot of these narratives that they've contributed to, if not the real declines in living standards, some of the disruptions in Americans' lives that Megan mentioned. Megan, coming back to you, you mentioned how you were talking about how friendshoring is important and like trade is still incredibly integral to our living standards and getting Americans the things that they want. Can you expand on that a little bit more, the importance of trade, how it's fed into these trends over time, and sort of maybe where you see us going from here?
Yeah, I mean, look, when you looked at what the administration's big reciprocal tariff, huge tariffs on Madagascar, because we buy a lot of vanilla from them and they don't buy a lot of what we make, right? They don't have a huge need for advanced software and services. They need T-shirts. And that, so first of all, there's a bunch of stuff like coffee, like vanilla, that just don't grow well in the United States or on the continental United States. There is coffee grown in Hawaii. I looked this up. It is enough to satisfy about 0.1% of Americans' daily demand for coffee. Coffee is incredibly finicky about its altitude, its humidity, its soil, everything. And so it's just not feasible to grow it here. We buy it from places that may or may not buy stuff that we make. And there's also things obviously like raw materials, like steel and so forth. But there's also, I will say, an environmental component to this. And this is something that I think the industrial policy people don't necessarily always think about. And this is going to sound a little grisly, but look, as societies get richer, one of the things they want to buy is they want to buy environmental quality. And so they put in regulations to control the negative externalities from doing various jobs. I think there is a place in that for libertarian thought, where you say, like, look, you have a right to do what you want on your property, but when the air or the water comes over onto my property, I feel okay getting the government involved to say, maybe not. And so, for example, I was talking to a chemist who works actually on something that is, strategically relevant, and we were talking about how to get chemical precursors, which is a big thing that is basically shifted to China and to some extent India, because they go into everything from pharmaceuticals to industrial solvents and everything else that we use. And he said, look, for a lot of these products, you would need a 500% tariff on China. And I asked him why. I was surprised by that. The labor cost difference is high, but it's not quite that high. And he said it's land use, because there's a bunch of different kinds of synthesis that are really dirty and that have really bad side effects if the plant explodes, and people do not want them in their backyard. So right now they basically all go into Louisiana, which has a slightly laxer attitude towards this thing. But even there's stuff they don't want. And so that stuff has been moved to other countries. As those countries move up the value chain, they will find ways. They will probably offshore those to other places that look at the trade-off and say, look, yes, this is dangerous. On the other hand, so is being poor. And hopefully over time, we're going to find cleaner ways to synthesize things, safer ways to do things. But it's also true of like lithium mining. It's just gross. It's repellent. We could lithium mine here. We don't want to. We don't want to do that to our environment. And that's a legitimate choice for a country to make. And so, some of this is just we trade because other stuff is elsewhere that we don't have. We also trade because skills are elsewhere that we don't have, right? Over time, manufacturing grows. I think it was Marshall who said that the skill of manufacturing textiles is in the very air of Lancashire, right? Is that over time, these agglomeration effects, you have a cluster. So, for example, the high-end photolithography machines that are used to make basically all high-end semiconductors. They're made by one company, 95% of them are made by one company in the Netherlands. And they've gotten extremely, extremely good at it. Now, we could do a big industrial policy effort, and we could try to get our own ASML. We might get there. It's not unheard of in the history of industrial policy for countries to pour massive subsidies into a sector often with some protectionism to prevent the competitive products from coming in, and eventually building up a sector, right? This is part of the story of the Asian tigers. That said, everyone loves to tell those stories of like the Samsungs. They don't love to tell the stories of all the companies that people poured just billions and trillions of dollars down the rat hole of trying to build. And it turns out that, if you're subsidizing something, if you're protecting it, the company doesn't necessarily have a lot of incentive to get better. And in the meantime, right, the Dutch are not going to rest easy, especially if you start subsidizing it. ASML is going to be trying to up its game. Are we ever going to catch up? Maybe, maybe not, but why not just buy the machines from them?
Right.
They are already really good at it. And especially when you're talking about our allies. Right, I do think that you can have questions about how dependent you should be on a geostrategic rival again. Although, again, I think you really have to think about the product. Like, if China cuts off our critical supply of T-shirts, is our military readiness, is that it? We can't invade Taiwan without enough T-shirts to clothe our troops. I feel like we could probably figure that problem out. And so you need to be highly selective, but you also have to recognize that if you do that, you're making a possible trade-off, because in general, protected industries are not renowned for their and heavily subsidized industries are not renowned for developing world-class capabilities. They don't have to. And that is the problem with industrial policy. I would add one more thing, which is that the U.S. government is almost uniquely bad at this stuff, right? And if you look at what happened with the CHIPS Act, right? We need daycare, and it has to be built by union workers at a 30% premium, and there's all of these land users, right? All of that stuff is stuff that we are not good at. Our state capacity is low relative to our wealth. Our government is simply not very good at doing things. It never has been, really. If you go to Denmark, you meet their regulators, their regulation's pretty good. And American regulation is not pretty good. And we have to work within what we have and not imagine this fantasy regulator who could, with their incredible foresight and a level of state capacity we don't have, conjure something out of nothing.
So we're neither in the state capacity utopia or the free market
Yeah,
utopia.
exactly.
We're in the sort of broken middle.
Some might say purgatory.
Norbert, you mentioned that we have this, that the China shock is maybe overstated, that we've had this long decline of manufacturing that predates a lot of these dates people point out to. Do you have anything to add to the story that Megan told and sort of how trade fits into this broader narrative?
Well, and one thing really fast too, that lower reliance on manufacturing jobs, that's throughout the developed world, which Megan actually I think touched on, even in China. But Germany, Japan, these countries rather that have the industrial policies that the populists want, actually don't work so well in those countries that they say that they're using as a model.
And if I can just break in for a second to point out that one reason this is happening is like factory jobs are terrible.
Yeah.
We look back on them kind of nostalgically because a small subset of manufacturing jobs paid really, really, really well because you had like the big three oligopoly or the steel oligopoly where you have people who have command of the market and the unions can just extract a huge amount of value that then gets passed on to the consumer. But in fact, if you go onto a factory floor, these jobs are repetitive, they're boring. One of the reasons they paid so well, the main reason for the legendary Ford, paid people $5 a day, doubling the average wage for a worker. And people in this space like to present this as like he did this so his workers could buy his cars. First of all, no. This does not work. You cannot make money by paying your workers enough to buy your products. Second of all, the reason he actually did this was these jobs were so tedious, so repetitive, so mind-numbing that the only way he could compete and keep workers on the floor was to pay nosebleed wages. And the companies want to move up because no one wants to do these jobs. No one wants to stand in one place and turn one bolt over and over and over again. They would much rather have a machine do this. Well, they want the pay. They want the prestige. They want maybe a job that fits better with the male psyche but they do not actually want to stick men and use them as like flesh robots, which is what those jobs really were.
And you can see that even with what's going on right now. They've been in the news the last few weeks. People from South Carolina, the garment industry, where that was decimated. People say, well, no, hell no, you don't want those jobs to come back here. Those jobs were awful. The same sort of thing. You don't want to work in that textile factory. And one thing on top of that, we did try to protect that and slow that down. We did have high tariffs on apparel, higher than most of the other goods that we have. So that didn't even work. The only thing I want to kind of add, just a little bit of a broader context. So trade, automation, technology, whatever we want to call that, and even immigration to a large extent. You can think of these all economically as a sort of like a labor saving or time saving device, if you will, right? If you trade instead of make it, yes, you don't need as many jobs to make that thing. That's true, but that frees you up to do other things, right? It's not a given that you'll automatically, instantly find all those things that you can now do. But that is still the point. If all we wanted were more jobs, we could easily do that, right? That would be the easiest industrial policy in the world. We're going to outlaw all the machines, and we're going to outlaw shovels. Everybody's going to have to use spoons now.
Yeah, this is the famous.
The Milton Friedman did, right? So that would be insane and incredibly counterproductive. And but the truth of the matter is, even the type of industrial policy that these folks are talking about in order to bring back jobs that have disappeared, that nobody wants, that we don't need because we're so much more productive, it's the exact same effect. It's a smaller scale and it's not as an extreme of an example, but if that's all we ever did, we would still be in the fields, right? We would all still be in the fields producing all the things that we eat. It's kind of the equivalent. I'm going a little crazy now, but it's kind of the equivalent of putting everybody on their own little deserted island and saying, we're not going to let you trade with anybody. We're not going to let you have anybody help you in any way. You're going to have to make all the stuff that you need on your own. Isn't that great? No, that's not great. And all we're doing is broadening it out from an island to a city, to a state, to a region, and a country. It's the same set of principles. These things make you better off from a time standpoint, from a resource standpoint. That is the definition of getting rich.
So these principles of trade and comparative advantage, I think you explain them well in the trade context. And that might be hard for some people, but I think it's often even harder in the immigration context to explain sort of the benefits there and how you can use a similar lens. Can you give us a little bit of sort of the benefits of immigration and how that fits into your story? Yeah,
immigration's the hottest of all hot button issues, I feel like, coming from the conservative movement, I suppose. But it is again the same sort of thing. It's instead of trade for something, you have somebody else competing with a job, right? So yes, it's true. Just like if you were to take my job, right, Adam? Which we're not going to do. But if we were to do that, that's one less job that we need if I'm not in that job, right? So there's a clear case of somebody competing for your job, you don't get that job. If that were the end of the story, okay, then that would be something, and that would be bad. And we would have massive unemployment problems in the United States, massive. But we don't. And we don't because it's not the end of the story. That person coming in, again, frees up somebody to do something else, whatever that might be. And more broadly, that other person represents demand for other goods and services, as well as demand for other goods and services to build and deliver those goods and services. So the fact that we have so many people here in the United States, people always compare us to Germany, Italy, Japan, whatever. We're 10 times as large. The market is huge, and that's why it's so much more powerful. That's why we're so much wealthier. More people is a larger market. It's a larger demand and a larger supply, and it makes it easier for people to specialize, which is again getting that productivity and figuring out what you're best at, and not wasting all of your time in the field, not wasting all of your time on the assembly line. some people like that, and that's great. If you've only got 10 people, 9 of them probably aren't going to like it. But if you've got 330 million people, well, then you're going to have a few more that'll probably like it and that'll maybe be good at it and want to do it. So you can't have that rich diversity if you close everything off.
Megan, this conversation around immigration and trade has this theme of there is some disruption behind it, where people need to find a new job, or we need to get better at doing something else that we used to manufacture. Now we're doing the service industry is growing. You've written a whole book on learning from failure and the sort of even the necessity of dislocation and learning from disruption. I'm wondering if there's anything you've learned in writing the book or talking about this that you can impart on us in talking about the importance of dynamism and competition, and that there is sort of a bigger picture benefit to this type of market process.
I mean, look, what I would say is creative destruction sucks if you are on the destruction side, right? People genuinely don't like that, and I think there's a lot of ways in which, look, if you have a family business that's been going on for 4 generations and now it's not viable, that's a really traumatic thing to happen. And we shouldn't minimize that. We should acknowledge that. I recently did a talk where I talked about the Luddites, and they had a point. As I contemplate the disruption of my own industry by various technologies, it's really hard and unpleasant. But the purpose of the talk was to talk about why we should do it anyway. And the thought experiment that I gave is, look, think about going back and try look at the difference between our life and theirs, right? We have every advance has been something that was brought to us by someone undergoing that process, where a new technology comes along, or or trade or something else, and comes along and competes with people who had something pretty good going. And that's unfortunate for those people. I remember my grandfather, he died he grew up on a farm. He owned a gas station, got off as quickly as possible, and then started a 2-acre garden, because I guess you can take the boy off the farm, but not the farm out of the boy. But, he died surrounded by everyone he'd ever loved, who had not predeceased him. And that's pretty special. And I think there were things about farm life that were better. Like, when you're aging on a farm, right, there's always something for an old person to do, even if they're not too spry anymore and maybe don't have all their marbles. You need to set them to shelling peas or something, right? You're surrounded by your family. It's a really nice way to kind of go through life. It has a lot of drawbacks, including the fact that if we were all at that level, we couldn't afford all of the technology that keeps us alive longer, makes us much more comfortable, right? My grandfather on that farm did not have indoor plumbing. He did not have air conditioning. He had, my grandmother, who also grew up on a farm, had 2 twin brothers die in infancy because incubators weren't available, right? All of these things that we take for having all of your children survive adulthood is major, or survive to adulthood. And almost no one loses a child before adulthood now. And that was an extraordinarily common experience. Even in my grandparents' generation, it was even more common before public sanitation was invented. All of those things, ultimately, they are made possible by this disruption. And when we are sitting here as the beneficiaries of all of that, and then we want to say, but stop. Yeah. No more. We have reached the apex, and now I want to slow everything down. And I think there's also a temptation, though, to point to other countries, like Denmark or whatever or Japan or whatever, and say, but they managed to do it. And I think a thing we should keep in mind is that America is the essential nation in terms of technological advancement. Not because we're the best people in the entire world, but because we are the biggest and freest economy. And when I think back to, I've been doing this now for a distressingly long time. And when I think back to all of the debates I've had, I have lived through multiple cycles of Germany is going to eat our lunch, Japan is going to eat our lunch, China is going to eat our lunch. But what's interesting is I've also lived through a lot of cycles of why can't we just have the Danish welfare state? Why can't we just have this? There's a lot of answers to that question. I think I've provided some of these in this conversation. But one thing you have to remember is that the trade-offs are different, right? If Denmark or even France stifles their rate of innovation, America's still out there doing it. And we are losing something. I think, for example, their pharmaceutical price controls mean we have fewer awesome new drugs, and that makes me sad and also sometimes extremely angry. But America is still subsidizing a ton of pharmaceutical innovation, so they can have cheap pharmaceutical prices by buying from those companies at like cost plus. They make their profits in the US market, same with medical devices, same with a lot of things. They get the benefits of all this innovation while having substandard policy. And yet, even then, I look back at those arguments 15 years ago, and I look at Europe now. Those arguments were a lot easier. Those arguments were a lot harder to win 15 years ago. And you now look at Europe, pretty good lifestyle, lots of leisure, beautiful old buildings from a period before they had the welfare states. But aging populations in rapid decline. Germany is struggling because they are now losing their manufacturing base, and which they kneecapped with a bunch of environmental regulations around things like electricity. And you look at the struggles. You look at the fact that the EU itself is issuing reports saying we are completely uncompetitive in the technologies of the future. We need to deregulate. And instead, what are they doing? They've got a whole commission that basically makes me click accept cookies right? They are busy trying to kneecap tech companies out of privacy concerns. And that stuff, I think when you look at that, it looks less and less attractive to try to do that model. You look at Asia, where they have done industrial policy, and they've gotten a lot of big industrial concerns, and their birth rates are crashing so fast that they are going to be in massive crisis very quickly, including China. And you ask yourself, is this what I want, or do I want a dynamic economy? We can talk about to what extent we should try to mitigate the cost to the losers, help them move into new jobs. I'm not against that. I have a pretty dim view of the effectiveness of those job training programs, but I'm totally open to discussing that kind of thing. But I think when you look at the benefits of having a big dynamic economy that's just out there innovating at the frontier all the time, America matters. What we do in America matters more than anywhere else. And if we take away our dynamism, no one else is going to step in and fill that role.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It is. Before I move on, for folks listening in online, we do have questions coming in here that I'll also be drawing on. One of the questions that has come in is this idea of shared facts, and how do we even have this conversation if it doesn't seem like we can even agree on sort of what these income trends are. I know this is where you started, Norbert, on this idea of whether or not you pick a specific time period or a specific deflator. Could you just sort of, maybe talk at a more meta level, like what do you see as the failure here? Like why are we not all on the same page? And then I don't know if Megan has anything to add on sort of talking about this from the media or writing about this on a day-to-day basis. Like, what is the disconnect?
I don't know that there's one thing that's a disconnect. And maybe Megan feels differently. But I mean, in researching the book and in dealing with this stuff for the last few years, as you know, I would read something like, just for example, in the Atlantic, and the journalist would say, the American middle class is being decimated, and then literally next sentence write about everybody moving up into the $100,000 more category, and I'm like, wait a minute, so that's a problem. Just a basic sort of understanding of what you're looking at as a problem. And I think that there's also a tendency, for whatever reason, I don't know if it feels like maybe it's a human tendency to just automatically sort of think that I'm doing worse than I am. And you look out and you see things and you think, oh, we're just not doing that well. And I think that's some of it. I know that there are some research papers that look at that, even in other countries, where if you ask people where they think they are in the distribution, they tell you, and it's actually a good 10, 20% lower, than what they really are. So I don't know if maybe that plays into it.
So I would say a couple things. I mean, first I would quote Richard Feynman's favorite adage about doing research, which is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. And then I would say that I think a lot of people confuse other things for the decimation of the middle class. So for one thing, I think journalism is indeed having this problem. right? Like, it was a lot easier to make a middle-class living doing journalism. Some of the superstars are doing better than ever, but it was a lot easier to just have a steady, reliable job. And that just totally infiltrates people's sense about the economy, right? Is that they feel like the economy has gotten way more precarious, and for themselves they are correct. But then, of course, when you go out and you start looking for evidence that other people are much more precarious, you're going to find it. There will be some out there. There's always, the data is always complicated. And so I think that that's also true that, so for example, I think there is a real social phenomenon that economist Raj Chetty has talked about. And if you go back to the Occupy Wall Street and the 1%, there were a lot of people who were convinced that the 1% were like taking all the good jobs and opportunities and leaving. And what this really was, and that they were speaking for everyone else. And what this really was in fact an intra-elite battle between extremely rich people and merely doing pretty well people. And now some of those people were in precarious positions, right? I still remember the story about the guy who had gone to get an MFA in puppetry because his school district would pay him more money. He was a teacher. If he got an MFA in puppetry, and the MFA in puppetry was very expensive, but then the recession happened, and his school district, while he was out, his school district cut back on the jobs, and then he couldn't get another job, right? And like, that is a sad story. I have been in that spot. I went to business school. I spent an unbelievable amount of money going to business school. It's actually not that unbelievable now, but it was then. It was $100,000. I graduated with $100,000 of student loans, and then 9/11 happened, the dot-com bubble burst. The consulting firm that I was supposed to work for collapsed, and I ended up spending 2 years trying to figure out what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And I was like panicking, and it was awful. And I also had all this debt. So when I finally decided I was going to be a journalist, I was making $40,000 a year as a special concession to my MBA, because the job paid less than that until they found an MBA to do it. And I had $1,000 a month in student loan payments, right? That was extremely unpleasant and bad. I did not like it. And that was a genuine thing that I'm glad it worked out. I'm glad I did it. But there was a period where that looked like I had made just catastrophically bad decisions because the economy had changed under me, and that felt really bad. But here's the thing: is actually to go back to Raj Chetty, and sorry for my discursive style here, but these people were convinced that gap between the 1% and everyone else was the most important thing in the economy. It was driving all of these. And in fact, what Raj Chetty says is, no, it's not. It's the gap between the bottom 25% and the top 25%. It's actually the fact that the upper middle class has managed to segregate itself much more effectively residentially than it did 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And that does actually matter for things like income mobility and for having a society that feels cohesive. But the problem was the people making the 1% critique were almost all people in the upper middle class who did not want to end that.
Right.
What they wanted was not to have billionaires competing for them with school slots, right? Like, they wanted to have billionaires not competing with them for stuff that they thought that their class was entitled to. Mm-hmm. They were not planning to move back to like Toledo and live in a lower middle class neighborhood, right? That was not part of their plan, but in fact, that's the thing that matters more for income mobility. And so I think there is just this consistent tendency to confuse your personal problems with the problem of America, and it's hard not to. Yeah. Right? It is really hard not to let your personal worries feel like, because then you see someone else who has them, you're like, oh my gosh, everyone has them. And actually, no, in any economy, lots of people are worried and anxious, and lots of people are doing well. And if you're one of the worried and anxious, it can be easy to turn that into a story about the whole world without realizing that you are cherry picking and that you're kind of letting that affect how you see the world.
I think on this point of income mobility, I think in the book you have a statistic of some significant portion of Americans spend at some point in the top 20% of the income distribution.
Yeah.
Or you speak to that. Can you?
It's about 70%.
Have those declined over time, or are we still relatively economically mobile?
No, we're still pretty mobile, and the gaps between the top and the bottom are despite some of the Piketty stuff, which has been debunked, are actually still pretty much the same that they were at the end of World War II. things haven't really changed all that much. We still have a lot of mobility. In the last 40 years, I think it was last 40 years, 70% of all working age Americans spend at least 1 year in the top 20%, and 80% never spend more than 2 years in the bottom 10%. So it's not that we have these separate permanent classes at both ends. It's just not the case. And you also have to be really careful when you look at that income distribution. It's like the quintiles, the groups of 20% of earners. That bottom quintile has a much smaller share of the population and an even smaller share of working age adults. And the households in that bottom group, most of them, I think it's about half of them, only have one working age adult. So they only account for, I think, about 5% of the work hours in the United States economy. So those are a lot of retired people. Those include a lot of disabled people. By all means, let's discuss if we're not taking care of them. I'm fine with that. Take my libertarian card away, yeah. But those two quintiles are radically different. Even the bottom 20 with the top 40 are radically different, just completely different. There's no way in the world that they would ever produce the amount of income that those either the top one or top two produces. It just wouldn't. It's just not even close to the same comparison.
We have another question here about healthcare and the education sector as being places. Megan, you mentioned the cost of getting a degree. These being two sectors that are where costs have gone up more than others, and how do often these are the pressures I think people are pointing to when they think things have become less affordable and that it's harder to get ahead. Well, what's going on in these sectors, if anything, and how does that fit into the trends that you identified?
Well, I mean, nobody likes to talk about the healthcare piece this way, but that's a great example. You have Medicare and Medicaid. You have an enormous chunk of the medical industry, let's call it, that is not free market. It's about as far as free market as you can get. Now, maybe you love that, maybe you hate that. However, if you don't like the prices that you're paying, and if you don't like the way you interact in that market, if you don't like the way you deal with your insurance company and your doctor, there's an enormous amount of government involvement that drives that definitely has to be front and center in that conversation as to how do you fix that. So it's absolutely positively not free markets that have done it. And it's largely the same with education.
Yeah, I think the three sectors that everyone always cites, housing, education, healthcare, right? So there's a couple things going on here. Number one, as you get richer, you're going to buy more of those things because, as I say, you don't actually want 7 washing machines. You want 1. You might buy a nicer washing machine, but ultimately you're just going to run out of your ability to consume.
Maybe 2.
Maybe 2. But you're going to run out of your ability to consume durable goods, and you're just naturally going to want to do things like become healthier and think greater thoughts and all of those things. The other thing is that these are sectors where the United States government at various levels has gotten incredibly involved, right? I think in healthcare, you can argue that the original sin is that when they're passing Medicare, they don't want any opposition from the American Medical Association. So they do what Britain did, or said it was going to do when it founded the NHS, which was stuff the doctors' mouths with gold, right? There's no controls. You just bill for your reasonable and customary fees. Well, doctors had a lot of leeway on what they considered reasonable and customary, and cost spiral, and we have been trying to undo that ever since, right? And the profession responds. And in some ways, it's actually good, right? The profession responds with a profusion of innovation, which we like. A lot of it is life-extending, life-improving. Similarly in housing, right? Once zoning gets in and people figure out, oh, I can make people not build houses around me, and then they realize, specifically, and I think this has a little bit to do with how fractured our governments are, specifically, I can make poor people not build houses around me. Or even not even poor people, young families, right? You come in as a young family, you've got a few kids, you're gonna be using a lot of school services, you're still starting out, your earnings aren't that high, you're not paying, right? What they want is people who are gonna pay a lot of property taxes and not use a lot of services. And then there's also the building codes and everything else, and all of these things drive up costs. And then people are like, but why are there no houses? Well, Why are they so expensive? Well, you kind of made it difficult to build them. And similarly in education, we, on the one hand, wildly subsidized it. And I think that even I, who have spent a lot of time thinking about education, have been a little shocked at some of the numbers of how much research we're subsidizing, which, by the way, I actually broadly favor, even if we can quibble about the amounts and details. But also the student loan program, the Pell Grant program. And because we now are giving them money, we say, well, we don't just want any fly-by-night to be able to get it. So now we set up accreditation agencies. And those accreditation agencies are basically faculty going in and checking on themselves. So they go to inspect and make sure that you're doing the same things that they're already doing. So not only have you made it so that you've got this little cartel that's hard to get competition into, you've also made it so it's actually really hard to innovate. Because when another professor comes in, what does he want to know? Do you have a PhD? How many publications, right? The stuff he cares about. And not, are your graduates graduating with reasonably low debt loads that they don't default on? Are they getting good job market outcomes, right? None of that is what they're looking at. And so all of those three, even as we have piled more and more onto the sector in terms of responsibilities for tending our young people and getting them good jobs. And so when people say, like, the market isn't working, it's like, well, the parts of the market you're not letting work indeed are not working.
Right. That's a good way to put it.
This toxic subsidy of both supply constraints and all of this money.
But we do both at the same time, right? We don't just do one dumb thing. We're like, what if we did both?
Yeah.
And the result is something that is very expensive, and that people feel unsatisfied with.
And housing's a great example. Like you're juicing, you're restricting supply like crazy, and you're juicing demand even crazier. Mm-hmm. What do you think's going to happen?
Well, with our last couple of minutes, I have a closing question that I'd like both of you to leave us with, and that's to give us one economic myth that you'd like to dispel, that you sort of see percolating out there, and then something to be hopeful for, a economic trend that you're excited about that's making everyone's lives better off. We can start with Megan and close with the author.
I mean, I think that the myth that I think is most dangerous is the one that Trump clearly holds, which is that trade deficits somehow mean like other people are ripping you off, right? Trade deficits mean that other people are giving you free stuff. And now you can ask whether that's sustainable, whether there are some vulnerabilities there, whether we should look at the productivity of our economy to try to make it more competitive. But mainly the reason we have a trade deficit is, first of all, that we're not saving enough, which I think is a real problem, and that we are a very attractive place to do investment because we're really dynamic and we're crushing it, and people want to be part of that. And so I would love to kill that myth. I think it will probably never die, but a girl can dream. And then the other, look, I am really hopeful about AI. I think it is going to be incredibly disruptive, and that we are really going to need to think hard about how to manage that disruption, both politically and economically, in a way that we did not do. I will say that a valid criticism is that around both trade and immigration, we did not think about what the political fallout was going to be and how to manage that better. And that is something we should think about with AI, because if indeed it comes in and displaces a lot of workers, those workers are going to be very upset. And we need ways to manage this, get buy-in for what I don't think it's going to increase GDP growth to 50%, but I do think you could get to 3 or 5%, right? 5 might be an outside, but that would be a huge change. It would solve so many of our fiscal problems. It would mean we were all richer and having more awesome stuff, right? You can ask questions about the social consequences and how to manage those again. But I'm quite optimistic about this, and I think that because I am so pessimistic about our government's ability to solve our fiscal problems, that anything that looks like it is going to solve our fiscal problems, I would be very happy with. So.
Okay, well, I can't take trade deficit now, but that would have...
Sorry.
No. I think the one that I would say is that the idea that we should be focused on getting manufacturing jobs. Like, those are the best jobs, right? Those were the best paying jobs. Well, the truth is they weren't. Service jobs were much better. They paid more. They were safer. People actually wanted them. That's why there are so damn many of them. So stop worrying about that. That would be the myth. On the optimism part, I
The
think
weird thing is that all the people making that argument are in service jobs, right? They're all sitting in offices writing
no
white
laptops.
papers. None of them are out there making like.
not anymore. No, I say that though, and you know, I allude to it in the book. I mean, my dad was basically a mechanic. You know, I spent my summers cleaning parts and learning how to weld, and like I could have done all that stuff. He didn't really want me to, and he didn't have to influence me all that hard. You know, I'm from South Louisiana. So I was doing all that stuff in 100+ degree, you know, sweatshop. It kind of sucked. I was happy to not do it for the rest of my life. And I wasn't that good at it, but that's a whole nother story. The optimism part, you know, I just think that we kind of go through these cycles where we make big mistakes and learn from them. I'm hopeful that we're doing that right now and that we're going to correct. Hopefully it doesn't get too bad before we correct.
Awesome. Well, thank you both.
Thanks.
That's all the time we have today. Thank you to Norbert Michel and Megan McArdle for an engaging conversation. I enjoyed it very much. One more time, the book is Crushing Capitalism, How Populist Policies Are Threatening the American Dream. I encourage everyone to pick up a copy and continue the conversation at home. So we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both.
Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.